Hey, this is John Zombro with The Lifetime Athlete, and thanks for joining me today. Hope you're having a great one. Today's video is a physical therapist's perspective on footwear for backcountry hunting. And this also includes mountain athletes and wilderness travelers of every type. And what I'm going to be talking about today is something that has come up for me over and over again. I've been hunting for 50 years, and I've been working in human performance for about 40 years. And one of the things that I do in coaching and training and rehabilitating athletes of all types is work with a lot of backcountry hunters. And so I wanted to talk about this topic, which has been visited quite extensively in our fields with an emphasis on biomechanics and health and performance. So here's what we're going to get into. We're going to talk very briefly about the foot, and then I'm going to go over some footwear or shoe ideas for training and for early season versus late season, wherever you may be, as well as a few issues with water crossings, the use of orthotics, and boot treatment. So let's jump right in. First thing I'd like to say is I'm not sponsored. I am not affiliated with any brand here, so I'm not going to be having any bias, and I'm also not doing in-depth reviews, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of these shoes and boots which I like. So first of all, training, and that's something that obviously we're doing year-round, but let's say you're right now, it's summertime, and you've been really training and preparing for late summer and into the fall. Perhaps that's going to be your season. One of the things I like to do in training is use relatively minimalist footwear. Now, to contrast that, I don't like to do that in the field. I like to be well protected and supported and have that day in and day out durability that quality boots yield. But for training, especially in the summer, if we can use a more minimalist shoe, we can actually strengthen the foot and all of its structures to possibly be more resilient and durable and injury resistant in the fall. So this shoe happens to be an Innovate shoe, and this is part of their barefoot line. It's the XF210, and it's basically a slipper with some traction. So I love this for gym work. It does give me good traction and safety, just as far as moving around, changing direction and whatnot, but very minimal. This is especially good for when you're performing deadlifts because it has a zero drop on the heel. Highly recommend something like that. I also encourage and participate in quite a bit of outdoor training, especially over the summer, and a lot of that's done on fields, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, grass or artificial turf, or even on tracks. And for that, I like a very lightweight, again, fairly minimalist shoe for that purpose. This happens to be a Nike Waffle Racer, but there are so many brands you can find any brand that you like, and these are relatively inexpensive, but they do make a big difference in your training if you happen to have these minimalist type shoes. Now, a lot of my summer training also includes rucking and just hiking in general. And for the most part, if it's warm, hot, dry in the summer, I'll just wear a trail running shoe. This is a Saucony Excursion Trail 15. And one of the things I like about this particular brand is it's relatively wide in the toe box while being narrow in the heel. So I can get a good fit, a good arch wrap around with the lacing system here, and the traction is fairly ample. So again, there's so many different models out there, but I do like to have this type of shoe. You could make an argument and say, well, could you just do everything in one shoe, athletic shoe, sneaker like this? You could, but again, I'm showing you some of the different things that are available. Another thing I like to do is some of my outdoor training on grass just totally barefoot. Again, you have to dose this or work up very gradually because a lot of the intrinsic structures of the foot will strengthen, but they do so quite slowly. So a lot of times I'll have a person just do a few minutes of walking barefoot in the grass, perhaps at the end of a workout, and then build up to the point by the end of summer where they can do a lot of their outdoor training barefoot. If that's possible and available, the return on investment is magnificent. Then we get into thinking about the hunting season, and I like to divide that up into an early season and a late season, and I'll do that with all of my gear, or at least most of it, particularly clothing and footwear. And I'm not going to be talking today too much, or at all, actually, about socks or gaiters, because I'm going to put that in a different video that's more clothing specific. With the early season, that's what these two boots here represent, I'll typically go with one of two styles of boot. I might use what typically is just called a light hiker, and these are ubiquitous. I've used practically every brand that you could name. I think some of those would include Loa, Oslo, La Sportiva, Salomon, Technica, Merrell, Garmont. This one happens to be a Vask, and I believe this model is called the Breeze. It's a really lightweight boot. Still has a Vibram sole and a Gore-Tex liner, but super breathable and light, and great for in the early season, especially when I'm not probably going to be facing much in the way of snow, and also if there are water crossings. This type of boot, I usually just wear it right through the water and not worry about it a bit. If it's not cold, it dries fast, and that is an attribute of these types. Other times I'll use what might be considered more of a dedicated hunting boot. And this one, this is actually an older one, you can tell from the wear. It's a Danner product, and it's not necessarily the highest end, but one of the nice things about these lighter boots is they'll typically be a bit more flexible, and the sole is usually a little bit softer rubber compound. This was just a tad higher, gives good coverage, but it's also all synthetic. That's a synthetic leather and then fabric with the Gore-Tex. And a nice boot, again, quite light. I like the light and fast approach in the early season. So one of the things I want to talk about related to this is fit. And fit is all based around what's called the last, or the shape that each manufacturer uses as a model to build their shoe or boot. And interestingly enough, you're going to find, or probably already have, one or several brands that really fits your foot and the shape of your foot better than most. And so by all means, stick with the brands that give you the best fit, because fit is king. You can usually get features and models across a product line to get what you need, but I always recommend understanding fit, trying on a lot of boots, and doing that when you're in the afternoon, maybe your foot volume's a bit higher, wearing the type of sock that you're going to wear in the field. All of those things do matter. And that brings us into talking about insoles or replacement insoles in boots. It's an option. It's not an option that everyone needs or wants to do, but a lot of times what the shoe manufacturers will do is they'll save a little bit of money on the insole, just essentially using something that's relatively inexpensive. It's a way to cut costs, but also a lot of manufacturers know that at the higher end, many users are going to prefer to replace this anyway. So in examining that, you kind of have some options that you can take. You can go with an off-the-shelf or over-the-counter product, of which there are many. This particular one has a heat moldable foam base, and it has a cloth top cover. But one of the things you're going to notice about any replacement insole or orthotic is it gives you a little bit better heel cup than the factory offering, usually a little better arch fill or arch contact as well. What that serves as a purpose, yes, it can help to support the foot, control motion, absorb shock more. All those things are true, but what it really does is it enhances your foot-ground interface, because it creates more of a total contact device out of your shoe, so you don't have a lot of airspace or movement between steps, and so every time you transfer, or every time you put your foot on the ground, you transfer force optimally or most effectively. So that's both in terms of propulsion or absorbing shock. You can also use, and this is, I like these quite a bit, ones that are made of foam, and so this is just an EVA or light foam, and camo paint job's kind of cool, but it's not necessary. But what I like about the foam surfaces is they tend to be a little less slippery than the cloth surfaces on the sock. So when going downhill, I will notice I don't have to necessarily lace my boots quite as tightly to prevent my toes from banging into the front of the boot. That doesn't usually happen with this type of insole. So I do like those. I've also been in the business for a very long time of manufacturing and fitting orthotics in my physical therapy clinic to clients. I'm going to be honest with you, the literature really supports, as does my experience, that for 80 or 90% of the population, the over-the-counter product is more than adequate. It does just as well as anything that might be custom. This one is made up of a few layers of foam, based off of a foot impression mold. And then this one, also done that way. It has a cork base. And so some people will swear by these, and I think whatever works best for you through trial and error, keep doing. But I'm here to say that you might be able to do just fine using some of these things that you'll find in some of your local stores. Okay. Now we get into talking about water crossing. So I'd already said before, in the early season, a lot of times I'll just plow through with a boot like this and not worry too much about it. But I prefer a Croc for the backcountry over a river sandal every time. In fact, a river sandal really is ideal for a river trip, not so much otherwise. These things are heavier than the Croc. These straps will tend to get wet, and you don't get the foot coverage and protection that a simple Croc can give you. These can go on the outside of a pack, and so when it gets into the later season, and I've got stream crossings, particularly if I don't want to waterlog a boot that's primarily leather and certainly more expensive, I'll use the Crocs. They also make wonderful camp shoes as well. So this is my preference. Camo, just an option. I think this was given to me as a gift, so enough said about that. Now, getting into this late season, what we're definitely looking for here is this. If I'm going to wear gaiters in the field, it's going to be in the later season and with these types of boots. The gaiters, and I'll talk about them in a future video, but they do give you that ability to dash through a shallow stream and not have to remove and go to any other footwear. And back to this, I just don't like wading barefoot anymore. It just seems, even if I train barefoot some in the summer and have to quote unquote toughen up my feet, it's just, I don't care for it. It's either uncomfortable or slippery. So I like the Croc for that. But back to these shoes. This is where you really get into the full-on serious hunting boot, I would say. So I hunt primarily in the Northern Rockies, and for me, the early season is mid-August, which usually is when antelope archery starts up, into early October, and then after that through most of October, November, I'm using a more substantial boot. And so these types of boots are going to have more aggressive soles, full rubber rand in many cases, a full grain leather on the exterior. So it's a heavier, more sturdy boot, and many of these come with a stiffness or flex rating from 1 to 5. I tend to like the boots that aren't quite as stiff, and then bordering on mountaineering style boots. I don't do a lot of sheep and goat hunting or rock and ice type work. If I did, I might change my mind. But when primarily I'm hunting elk and deer in the backcountry, this is a really good setup for me. So this boot is a bit lower in height, and that usually if it's not snowing, I'll go to something like this. And when there's snow, even with a gaiter, I'll probably just prefer something taller. So this is the Crispy Nevada. It's been a great boot. I've had this for several years, more than several actually, and it's just been fantastic. And I think that's true of any of these higher end boots. You definitely get what you pay for, and quality is eminent. Well, this is uninsulated Gore-Tex boot. I prefer the uninsulated boots all through the season, mainly because I'm moving quite a bit and I just don't tend to get cold feet. But also, the insulated models will tend to have a little bit of pack out over time, and the fit can change, and I just don't, I've never cared for that. Don't need the insulation personally, at least during most of my mountain hunting in the backcountry through November. Love the Crispy Nevada. I also often will use this boot, the Zamberlan Wasatch, this one is, and relatively light for its size, but again, very similar in terms of features and very confidence inspiring. A lot of people in, let's say, the thru hiking or ultralight backpacking crowd will really say they like to use a shoe like this all the time, and that works fine for summer hiking, particularly on trail, carrying a very light pack. But in the hunting world, when you're out there day after day, off trail, often with very heavy loads on your back, a full-on dedicated hunting boot is really an ideal and most appropriate choice. Talk about fit for a minute from a different perspective. Let's say you've got the brand and you like the fit, but break-in is a factor with some of these heavier boots. And where a lot of the comfort comes into play for many people is this flex point. You can see how this is challenging for you to flex, but in the shoe industry, when the boot bends right there, this is called the toe break. And a lot of times it's based on how the boot is constructed, and there may be a shank in there. Less likely to be a steel shank these days. They're using thermoplastics or polymers, but nonetheless, that does make the boot a bit stiffer. Well, a lot of times a person will get forefoot pressures or discomfort, and it changes how they may feel across their instep or even in their toes because the boot hasn't gotten enough of a flex yet. You don't need much, but sometimes when these boots are new, they're super rigid. So what I like to do is actually, be careful with how you do this, but use a heat gun on low temperature, maybe about 250 degrees, and don't hold it right against the boot, but gently, from a distance, heat this boot for several minutes until it becomes slightly more pliable. And then you can actually work on flexing the boot. And I like to actually do that on the floor where I can press down and create some bend. And then when I'm finished, I'll actually wedge, however way I can do that, maybe with a heavy dumbbell or something, the boot in a slightly flexed position as it pulls. Now this doesn't damage the boot at all. It probably builds in the tiniest bit of rocker which a broken-in boot will have in the sole, but you can speed up your break-in. A little pro tip for you by trying that. The other thing that we typically will look at is these coatings, waterproofing coatings, water resistance improving coatings. And so for the full leather boots, I will typically use products like this. This one happens to be a Kinetric waterproofing boot wax, and it's a kind of a beeswax-based product, probably has some silicone in it, whatnot. Usually for every trip, I'll do a thin coat and give it a buff, and it does help quite a bit. It may actually impact breathability slightly, but in these heavier boots, I think the water repellency is well worth it. I've used other brands as well, and again, they're all excellent at the higher quality levels. Kinetric, Hanwag, to name a few, as well as some of the other brands that I mentioned previously. And this brings me to getting to the end of this video, and people will ask me often, well, what about pack boots? I say, well, I don't really use pack boots or heavily insulated winter boots in the backcountry. It's more of a front country option, but if you've ever sat in a tree stand in November or a duck blind in November, if you're not wearing waders or different things, an insulated boot is helpful. I have used the taller pack boots, which have the wool felt liners, which are removable. Schnee's is a great brand, and I have a pair of those boots. I just happened to grab this is a Cabela's product, and it's thin-slate line. I think you can see that, and I also put a wool felt insole in there. Fairly warm, but it does give you a little bit of ability to hike short distances. I would never take this far into the mountains though. And also I would mention that I'm not a big fan of camo paint jobs on shoes. It's really just a marketing thing, but sometimes the shoe that you're buying only comes with the camo option. So that's a relatively quick look at footwear from a PT perspective for the backcountry hunter and the mountain athlete. If you'd like more information on this topic, you can go to thelifetimeathlete.com, and there is an article as well as a podcast episode on this subject, in addition to many other resources which you might find valuable. So guys, thank you for joining me today. I hope this video was helpful, and until next time, this is Coach Jay-Z signing off.